Welcome to the Brattleboro Literary Festival 2020. It is my distinct honor to be here to introduce Steve Almond. Steve is the author of 10 books of fiction and nonfiction, including the New York Times bestsellers Against Football and Candy Freak. His short stories have appeared in the Best American Short Stories, the Best American Mysteries, and the Pushcart Prize anthologies. His essays and reviews have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and elsewhere. Steve co-hosted the New York Times Dear Sugars podcast with Cheryl Strait and is now teaming up with a number of creative writing centers to conduct a series of workshops for democracy, which I believe that he will be telling you about a little bit as we go forward. I first got to know Steve through Grub Street and Muse in the Marketplace conference, where I have been continually impressed with his iconoclastic brilliance. And so I know you are in great hands. It gives me a lot of pleasure to introduce Steve Almond.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim. Iconoclastic brilliance is definitely an upsell. So it's pure disappointment, but I'm glad everybody's here. And what I'm going to ask, I'm going to read a little bit from this book, Bad Stories, What the Hell Just Happened to Our Country, but not a lot. And my hope is, that I can just not have to do that much reading at all, because people will have questions. And those questions can be about anything that I'm reading or anything else. If people want to ask me about my hair, I'm not going to have very much intelligent to say other than this is quarantine. You are looking at the physical, objective correlative of quarantine. It's right here on my head. So this book was written after the election in 2016 in an effort to explain to my children, who were at that time, 10, 8, and 3, in a very basic way, why the adult world had made this decision, kind of collective decision. And it was predicated on my not being an academic, my being kind of an apostate journalist. I was a journalist for a while, and then I became a fiction writer and now do sort of nonfiction, creative nonfiction. But primarily what I do is I'm a storyteller. And as I thought about it, the easiest way to explain to my kids, the most elemental way to explain to my kids what had happened, was to say this outcome was authored by a series of bad stories that Americans have been telling themselves and telling each other for a long, long time. And so the book is really an effort to sort of pull back from the doom scrolling and the bad outcomes that we're continually reading about in our feeds, and to say what bad stories led to those bad outcomes. And I'm also interested as a writer in trying to sort of put the lens of literature on the election. So the book is just a bunch of bad stories, some of which, instead of chapters, it just has bad stories, some of which are things like, the United States is a representative democracy, which is something that's wishful. It's an ideal, but it's never been true, right? Not ever. And we can see the voter suppression as an extension, really, in a way, of the Jim Crow laws and of the era in which human beings in this country were enslaved and women didn't have the vote, and really only landed men had the vote. So it's never been a representative democracy. And then there are others that have more to do with sort of the patterns in our culture, our sort of abject dependence on sports as a way of kind of expressing our tribal identity, for instance, or the idea that on the left, we're, sort of our comedians, our court jesters are going to save us. These kinds of bad stories. And there are also ones that have more to do with sort of the psychology and emotion of the way that we operate as citizens. We're a country, there's a human tendency, but there's an American specialty in which we exalt our grievances as a way of hiding our vulnerabilities. And good demagogues and corrupt political actors exploit that. They poke at our negative primal emotions to get us to behave in ways that are usually against our own interests. So I'll read a little bit from the book, and I'm most interested in just getting people's questions, and so I'll keep an eye on the chat. As I struggled to make sense of the 2016 election, my mind kept spiraling back to one particular scene in American literature: Ahab, perched upon the quarterdeck of the Pequod, a grand, ungodly, godlike man with a prosthetic leg fashioned from a whale's jawbone. The captain has come to announce the true nature of his mission, which is not economic in nature, but deeply personal. He seeks revenge against the Leviathan that maimed him and exhorts his crew with a soliloquy Trumpian in pitch, if not diction. Here's what Ahab says. All visible objects are but pasteboard masks. He's roaring, right? If man will strike, strike through the mask. How can the prisoner reach outside except by thrusting through the wall? To me, the white whale is that wall shoved near to me. Sometimes I think there's naught beyond, but 'tis enough. He tasks me, he heaps me. I see in him outrageous strength with an inscrutable malice sinewing it. That inscrutable thing is chiefly what I hate, and be the white whale agent or be the white whale principal, I will wreak that hate upon him. Talk not to me of blasphemy, man. I'd strike the sun if it insulted me. I'd strike the sun if it insulted me. That is not even the subtext of every presidential tweet. It is the text. Whoever it is, if you insult me, I will strike out at you. It is this volcanic sense of grievance that fuels Melville's saga, that binds the crew of the Pequod to their leader. Quote, Ahab's quenchless feud seemed mine, Ishmael tells us rather helplessly. Who can blame the kid? Ahab is something like a natural force, a vortex of vindication, as mighty as the beast he pursues. And I go on to describe what happens at the end of Moby Dick. So just to ruin that American epic for you, they chase the white whale for 4 years. They find the white whale. The white whale is not pleased, and he drags everybody under with the exception of Ishmael, who survives by clinging to a coffin made of American wood. Symbol alert. Melville is offering a mythic account of how one man's virile bombast can ensnare everyone and everything it encounters. The setting is nautical, the language epic, the allusions biblical and Miltonian and Shakespearean, but the tale, stripped to its ribs, is about the seductive force of the wounded male ego and how naturally a ship of state, a ship steered by men, might tack to its vengeful course. The plot of Moby Dick pits man against the natural world, but its theme pits man against his own nature. The election of 2006 was, in its way, a retelling of this epic. Whether you chose to cast Trump as agent or principal hardly mattered. What mattered was that Americans joined the quest. Whether in rapture or disgust, we turned away from the compass of self-governance and toward the mesmerizing drama of aggression on display. The capitalist id unchained, and all that it unchained within us, Trump struck through the mask, and it was enough. When I started writing this book in the months after the election, I was furious and frightened, worn down by decades of disappointment, and determined mostly to launch harpoons at those I imagined to be my adversaries. That, too, is a part of the story. The great peril of our age is not that we have turned into a nation of Ahabs, but of Ishmaels, passive observers too willing to embrace feuds that nourish our rancor and starve our common sense. It is this outlook that laid the groundwork for the ascent of Donald Trump and has, as of this writing, sustained his chaotic reign. I am struggling in these pages to see Trumpism in a different light, as an opportunity to reckon with the bad stories at the heart of our great democratic experiment, and to recognize that often embedded within these bad stories are beautiful ideals and even correctives that might help us to contain the rage that has clouded our thoughts. I've taken Ishmael as my guide here, for while it's true that he falls under the spell of Ahab's folly, as did I. He is also its only surviving witness and chronicler, the voice left to impart whatever wisdom might be dredged from the deep. Amid the spectacle of a mad captain and his murderous quarry, we mustn't forget that Moby Dick is a parable about our national destiny, in which the only bulwark against self-inflicted tyranny is the telling of the story. And we are all trying to, I think, in our own ways, that's part of our job, is to tell the story of what these years were and what went wrong and who got hurt. I'll read one more little section and then I will literally plead with you to ask questions if you have any, because otherwise I'll simply stare at you or I might try to redesign my hair in some fashion. I don't think that's going to be a very good use of our time. But let me read one more little quick section that's at the very end of the book. Uh, on the day after the election, I was swimming with my son, Jude. We were in Florida at a writing conference, and on the way to the hotel pool, I spotted a young father with his daughter who looked to be about 3. I also, at this time, had a daughter who was 3. She was seated on the chaise lounge next to her dad, happily munching on potato chips. "Let's not have any more snacks," the dad said. "It's going to be dinner soon." The girl continued to feed chips into her mouth at a slightly greater clip. "Good luck with that," I said to the dad ruefully as I passed by. He laughed, and we felt that instant kinship shared by fathers of young, iron-willed daughters against whom we know ourselves to be essentially powerless. Some minutes later, my son pulled me to his side in the shallow end of the pool. "Look at that man," he whispered. "Look at what he's wearing." I glanced up and saw the young father with whom I had just shared a moment of levity, a bright red "Make America Great Again" hat perched on his head. Jude wanted me to react with horror, I think, or at least indignation. But I had no idea what stories had led this guy to put on that hat. I knew only that he was a father, like me, an American, on vacation, and at the mercy of his lovely daughter. To make any further judgment about him would be a failure of moral imagination. We're suffering from enough of that already. The real question, then, is what stories guide our fellow citizens? How have these stories led so many to squander their franchise, to accept the idea that we can be united by those who sow discord, or made great without admitting what, in our weakest moments, we are? Amid the constant prod of monetized distraction, can we slow down and start to connect the dots between our compulsive consumption of entertainment and the degradation of our public discourse, between the bread and circuses and the corrupt leaders? Can we activate what David Foster Wallace called the deep need to believe? If we're ever going to get out of this mess, we can no longer fritter away our passion on tribal contempt. We have to fight in a new way. We have to be the fools in charge of forgiveness. Now, sometimes when I read that line, we have to be the fools in charge of forgiveness, people have taken me to mean somehow that everybody is just doing their best and we should kind of forgive people, despite what their beliefs and behaviors are. And that's not really what I mean. What I mean, in a sense, is that we have to find a way to activate our empathy and humanity so that we don't get caught in a cycle of kind of cynical, reactive aggression or counter-aggression. And it has something to do with the idea of what Wallace Stevens, the poet Wallace Stevens, called the pressure of the real. He was writing about this kind of unending drumbeat of bad news that ultimately, especially for people who are passionate readers and writers of whatever sort, and artists in general, I think, winds up making us feel that whatever we might do is futile, when in fact that is the moment of surrender. That is the moment of imaginative surrender. If we allow the pressure of the real to crush out of us our imaginative capacity, and most centrally our capacity to imagine and try to cast into words the experience of people other than ourselves, then we essentially have lost our most powerful form of resistance. So I don't mean that we have to be, forgiving of despicable and hurtful behavior. The people who authored the concerted plan to separate families of refugees fleeing violence in terror and deprivation at our southern border, and who took young children away from their parents, um, uh, should be held responsible for the lifelong trauma that has been inflicted on all of those families. That is an abomination. It's more or less the exact opposite of what Christ would do in such a moment, faced with such a situation. But I don't think I see that as a cause to be furious. I see it as a cause of deep despair, just absolutely deep despair. That we would reach such a point, and that we would be complicit as a society, as a culture, in allowing such torture, frankly, without thinking about our part in the family of man. At the time this is going on, and still have little kids. And it is not exactly a huge leap to say, well, what if I were born into the story of being in a Central American country plagued by violence, or simply by poverty or political instability, and wanted to come to a country where I felt I and my children would have a better shake in things? We're just lucky, is what it is. Brian is asking me to talk about sports, and I will. But the central thing I think about is, if you're born an American, especially a white male, straight American, as I was born on third base, maybe halfway home. Doesn't mean I haven't worked hard to try to be a good, I don't know, father, partner, writer, artist, citizen. But it does mean that I was born literally halfway home, all the way past first, second, third, and a half. And there are a whole bunch of other people who are born into a very different story. And it is the job of artists, among the other jobs that we have, to be able to understand, to have the moral imagination to understand the suffering of others, and others who are in dramatically different circumstances. Part of the reason that that is difficult is that we get distracted, and we get distracted by spectacles that are ultimately childish, that return us to a part of ourselves that comes before the age of morality. And I think sports, speaking as somebody who's a passionate sports fan, and who played sports all growing up, and watched sports all growing up, and wrote a whole damn book about trying to check under the hood of football, and check under my own hood, and see what I was getting from it, and also see what it was doing to me. I have to say that if you really track it, in a way, our inability to sort of turn away from football, for instance, a sport where we know a third of the participants are going to wind up with brain damage, because the NFL has admitted that, or let's say it's 20%. But we know that there's this workplace where, just because of how violent it is and how big and strong the players are, even though we can't see it because it's hidden underneath helmets and uniforms, a fifth to a third of that workforce is going to wind up with brain damage, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or some other form of brain illness. And that would be unacceptable in any other realm of our lives. If the military reported that, if McDonald's, if Amazon, we'd be like, oh, let's have an investigation. This cannot stand. You can't have a workplace that's that dangerous. But because it is our version of the Roman gladiatorial games, that place we go, the arena, to be with others, and to see, basically, for the most part, male aggression on display, and to feel a sense of identity that is rooted in that kind of need to dominate and to identify with the dominator. It's not just not off limits, but it's on prime time all the time. It's the biggest thing in America, not just the biggest sport, but the biggest form of where our attention goes. I think probably bigger than religion even at this point. And that means something. People can say, oh, sports are dumb or superficial, but anything that people are paying attention to and are that passionately involved with, it means something to them. It affects their inner life. It shapes how they see the world. And as you have seen other forms of communal identity erode, sort of Rotary clubs, and growing a sort of community that grows out of a community of faith, or out of a connection to your neighbors, and a kind of dependence on them, mutual dependence on them. As we become more atomized, and our sort of retail market has become more homogenized, we don't feel a sense of identification as powerfully in these organic ways that connect us to other people. And so we seek that out in these tribal, I think, in these tribal allegiances. And the world of sports is very simple. It's basically the world of Donald Trump, to put it bluntly, What matters is that you win. And in order for you to win, somebody has to lose. And you can have a sort of romantic attachment to the idea of perseverance and teamwork. But at this point, it is such an endeavor that it's clearly transactional. I root for teams, and I'm really rooting for laundry, because the players, when the right opportunity comes along, or the management or the owners decide to ship a player out, it's just going to be a new team. So what am I really rooting for at that point? I think I'm rooting for a kind of make-believe identification with the need to be a winner, and above all things to avoid being a loser. And when you are soaking in those, when that's in the groundwater, somebody like Trump, who speaks about winning and power and dominance and returning to a time where violence is not only acceptable but is a real display of strength, becomes a lot more possible. So that's part of what I'm trying to write about in this chapter about sports. And people like Obama, would say, "Oh, well, sports is really, brings us all together, and Jackie Robinson broke through, and that was a moment of cultural unity." And I think that's true, but it lives alongside a much more fundamental truth, which is that our devotion to sports is symptomatic of our kind of capitalist id, the need to win at all costs and to avoid being seen as a loser at all costs. And when that's your central allegiance, then you wind up, when a candidate speaks that language, it is very powerful, even if that candidate is a professed and enthusiastic sexual assaulter and is a lifelong failure economically, and wouldn't recognize the truth if it smacked him in his fat red face. He knows how to speak that language. So, all right, let's see. Tim asks, as a bad story, is Moby Dick part of the problem or part of the solution? And it's interesting. What I would say is that Moby Dick is a parable that was written in Melville's time as an effort to come to grips with the American story. And that's why there are 30 crew members. They represent each of the 30 states. And there's all this sort of the various characters in Melville's own construction of the novel were really symbolic proxies. And so as I reread it, I saw all of these connections. It was very clear to me. But that's a parable. Literature is what you make of it. It isn't a part of the problem or a part of the solution. It is a way of understanding. And that's really how I see stories. So that, for instance, there's another mention in the book of, there's lots of Baldwin. And I talk a lot about, for instance, the parable sort of 1984 versus Aldous Huxley's sort of dystopic novel, Brave New World. And what I try to get at is that really the world that we live in, and this is all Neil Postman's kind of cultural critique, we're not going to wind up with a totalitarian state that looks like Orwell, where Big Brother is everywhere. What we're going to wind up with, and what we are, I think, seeing, is a world in which we're hypnotized by our own pleasures. We're hypnotized and sort of anesthetized by our own diversions, by entertainment, by all of these screens that we're staring into. They get smaller and smaller, and as they do, we get closer to the screen and our horizon gets narrower and narrower. And when that happens, you're not able to see the real world and what's happening in the real world, and get out of somebody else's narrative and the passive consumption of that narrative and into your own consideration of your place in the world and who else is in that world and what they're suffering or striving for. So I think a lot about, or I try to use in the book, stories as a way of understanding. For instance, And the Rock Cried Out is a story by Ray Bradbury, and it's a short story he wrote back in the early 60s, and it was basically a story about what would happen to white people if the era of white hegemonic control suddenly ended. In this short story, written again in 1962 or 63, you have a white couple down in a South American country, and all of Europe and the United States has been decimated by nuclear war. And this white couple is gradually sort of stalked and killed by the natives, partly because they refuse to accept that if they want to survive, they're going to have to take a lower place on the totem pole. And it is a parable about the language of white supremacy and the underlying racial anxiety of replacement. Jews will not replace us. It is all about the fear, what I call fear of a brown planet, which is that the days of white people running everything, and especially white men, are coming to an end, and a long overdue and deserved end. We have been at the center of power and at the center of our stories for millennia, forget decades or centuries. And I think the fear on the part of white people, as speaking as one of them, is, gee, if the minority becomes the majority and they treat us in the way that we've treated them, we should be frightened, having committed, a genocide in order to start the American experiment, and then consented to the peculiar institution of slavery. And when that was finally decided through a war, then you had Jim Crow. And then you had, a steady stream of lynchings, and now we have voter suppression and African American men and women being killed before our eyes on video screens. So the feeling, understandable amongst white people, might be, gee, if they behave as despicably as we've behaved, we're in a lot of trouble. All right, let's see. There's some more questions. I know this is must be so exciting for you guys to hear this grim stuff. But anyway, Bill Murray, one of my favorite actors, asks, those tribal allegiances seem to be encouraging us to lose all empathy and connection to others, especially others who may not be part of our tribe. Yes, that's what I mean about we have to be the fools in charge of forgiveness. If we are successful in removing Donald Trump from office, how do we recover our empathy, even for those who strayed into MAGA land and may not yet see how badly, may not see how badly that has undermined our country? Bill, what a brilliant question that is. And I will not have a brilliant answer for you other than to say that is what I mean by we have to be the fools in charge of forgiveness. I believe strongly and deeply that there are far more citizens of good faith in this country than there are people who have allowed their grievances to overtake their vulnerabilities, who have given in to the whispered propaganda of the hate mongers and demagogues who occupy the AM radio dial and some parts of the television dial, and who have been pouring poison into people's ears for 40 years. There is nothing that you are going to say that will bring them into your epistemology. And in a way, the only thing you can do is to try to model good and decent behavior and also not get caught up in where they are. I'm not saying don't care about them. I'm saying it's not your job to convert them. It's your job, to the extent that you can, to try to keep your own fanatical optimism alive and be as politically active as you can. That is our job. And if there is a possible single good thing that comes out of all the destruction and suffering and ruin of this time, it is that we now understand that democracy is not a self-driving car. It will drive us into a ditch of despair and cynicism and discord and anxiety and sorrow if we do not step up and realize, in this complex world with all these problems bearing down on us, we have to be citizens of good faith. We have got to take a more active interest in the experiment of self-governance. How are we going to take on climate change? We cannot keep bouncing from one disaster to another with these corporate psychopaths, continually figuring out a way to manipulate the system to take advantage of each crisis. We have to be able to figure out, and one of the things that I write about at length in the book, and it sounds wonky, but it really feels essential to me, is we have to figure out how to get some version of a fairness doctrine back into our media. And the fairness doctrine was simply a doctrine when radio came up at the beginning of the 20th century. Smart people said, holy cow, the founders did not deal with a medium that could reach millions of ears all at the same time in such an intimate way. If the wrong people get a hold of these powerful tools of disinformation, potentially, we're in a lot of trouble. And so they came up with first the radio doctrine, then the Mayflower doctrine, and then the fairness doctrine. And all the fairness doctrine said is, if you're going to use the public airways to have discourse and to have a radio station or TV station, you have a responsibility. The government is going to force you to include all reasonable shades of opinion in your coverage of important issues. And what it did basically was stop what has happened when it was removed by Reagan, which is the sudden development of these silos, these media silos, where people could be completely insulated from a set of facts that were inconvenient and therefore completely manipulated by a worldview crafted by a brilliant demagogue who is being paid by advertisers richly to be a brilliant demagogue and to speak to them in the language of white supremacy, of totalitarianism, of kind of monetized paranoia. And I believe that government has a role in regulating powerful media. And that's true of radio and TV and Twitter and Facebook and all these corporations that are making billions and billions of dollars by capturing our attention. And the way that they make all that money is by agitating us and keeping us upset and engaged with trolls. And that's the opposite of what an effective and true fourth estate is supposed to do. It's supposed to tell us more about the world that we live in and make us aware of the real problems, not creating a bunch of phony ones. It's not supposed to poke at our primal negative emotions to get us stirred up. That's what a corporation does when it wants to increase its advertising revenue. So that's one thing that I hope future administrations will take up is renewing some form of the fairness doctrine. Of course, the moment you mention this, all the demagogues get absolutely terrified because their bread and butter is the idea that they can create these ditto heads who hear nothing but their little sort of version of the world where they have all the answers and there's always some brown person who's to blame or some feminazi or whoever the convenient marginalized group is. It's never the corporations. It's never the powerful who are keeping down the disenfranchised. So I'm hoping that is something that will come back on the table. But a lot of it comes down to people who were not profoundly political previously or civically engaged, simply recognizing that if they are not going to step up, there are other bad actors who are gonna. Think about it. Right now, what we're facing is a judiciary that the GOP agenda, which is essentially the agenda of corporate polluters, corporate forces that want to the extent they can, keep extracting the world's resources and squeezing blood from that particular stone. They have bought and paid for a federal judiciary that is wildly out of step with what the American people want. The vast majority of American people want everybody to be able to vote. They want to have sensible gun control regulation. They want to start really addressing climate change. They want women to have reproductive rights and a right to their own goddamn bodies. That's the vast majority of Americans. So why are these things still being litigated? Well, if you can spend billions of dollars buying a judiciary, and they want money out of politics too, then you can if you can't get it legislatively, then you can get it in the judiciary, and that's what this Barrett nomination is all about. So there's still going to be a lot of work to do, but the central thing that Trump was able to do is prove to everybody that in an attention economy, if you make bad stories the central stories, you're going to end up with a set of bad outcomes. And I hope we learn that lesson. All right. Karen asks, how do Americans who are not part of the choir learn to gather and sing? Well, that's a lot of the reason I do these workshops for democracy, because we're out of practice. I was a kid of Watergate. My parents were hippies, and my dad didn't think twice about going to protest the Vietnam War, even though he had little kids at home, even if it meant he was going to get arrested. He didn't think twice about it. He didn't think twice about losing his job at the university where he taught because he organized people. We're out of practice. And we're out of practice because we have been coasting along on our kind of imperial dominion for a long time. And that time is over. We see now the logical extension of this kind of phony version of America that has been peddled by various demagogues all throughout American history. But I'm thinking back to the Reagan era in particular. The tax rate for top earners in America under Eisenhower was 92%. And under Kennedy, it was 75%. And you know what? We had a huge post-World War II boom because there was a redistributive function to our tax code. We have got to get back there. A country with this much plenitude can solve its problems. It just means that the people who have consolidated wealth and power are going to have to give it up, and they're not going to give it up willingly. We have to take it from them, and not by storming the castles, but by storming the ballot booth. That's just the only way to do it. Let's see. Joanne Rhodes asks, where does socioeconomic status fit in the radical divide, or maybe even racial divide? If you have a significant piece of the pie, how willing are you ready to share and help others rise above their circumstances? Joanne, I can't answer these questions well, but they're exactly the right questions. I don't know. I am living in ridiculous, by historical standards, ridiculous plenitude. Everybody listening to my voice, just by virtue of the fact that you have time to devote yourself to literature, there's a good chance that you are really doing quite well. And I long for a government that will come along and say to me, a writer with 3 kids and a wife, our household income is maybe 120,000 a year, 130,000 a year, to say, good, take the portion you need and spend it wisely and compassionately. Please don't spend it on bombs. Please don't spend it on missile systems. Spend it where it needs to go. I would, at least my personal feeling is, please, can we stop the cult of greed? And that means that people who have more, whether it's a little more or a lot more, have to be willing to say, you know what, this isn't some socialist dream, but we could be closer to the European countries where we make what I think is a very good bargain to say, well, we're going to pay higher taxes, and in exchange for that, people aren't going to have to worry about student debt or going bankrupt or not being able to pay for medical care. And that feels like a pretty fair arrangement in a bunch of countries that fundamentally have so much of the world's resources. Okay, let's see, and let me just see here if there are a few other questions. Anonymous attendee says, yes, how about the increasing concentration of wealth at the top? Yeah, well, look, this is the way that capitalism functions. It is a centrifuge, and it spins faster and faster, and it concentrates wealth and power at the top. And every effort to do that, whether it's gerrymandering or voter suppression or the inequality built into the Electoral College, which is basically an election by slaveholder math, or even the Senate, which has become a wildly, pathetically unrepresentative body. People on the left, or people who are citizens of good faith, forget the definitions of left and right. Just citizens of good faith have to look at this and say, gee, there are 5 million people in DC. They deserve representation. If Puerto Rico wants statehood, they deserve representation. They shouldn't have to be begging for paper towels from this maniac. So there is a basic sense that we need to step back from the situation and recognize the story. And the story is fundamentally one of not an inequality that is by accident or happenstance, but by his clear design. And you have to follow the money and figure out who's trying to keep a hold of the power and how they're doing so. And I'm so hopeful to see particular political actors, AOC I'm thinking about in particular, but Lauren Underwood, many of these Congress people who are really idealists and quite optimistic, and are raised in an era where they are very wise to the way that people have been trying to cling to power and money. Now, it's predominantly white and male, but greed is greed. It's colorblind. And the idea is for us to try to speak in a language that is just reflexively more compassionate, more generous, more aware of other people's suffering. That's certainly our job as writers and artists, but it is the job of political actors to speak in that way. And part of the terrible poverty, the moral poverty of this time, is to have this droning, selfish, sad, bald, tiny dick dude at the center of everything. And the only message he can deliver is, wah, 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 I want some love, and if I can't get it, then I'm just going to hate. It's just an impoverished way of looking at the world. It's a dead end. And I'm so ready for a different kind of rhetoric. And when that comes about, and there is a more compassionate set of voices that are the dominant voices, I am hoping that they will start to be able to suggest and push into the mainstream policy that's more or less at this point common sense, moral common sense, economic common sense. We have to get off fossil fuels. We have to start taking that seriously, and we can create a zillion jobs doing it. And, Biden is not my first, second, or third choice, but he seems to recognize, perhaps because he has suffered profoundly in his life and he's had to admit that he's wrong and he is course corrected. And that's ultimately what a good democracy does. It isn't flawless, it self corrects. The last story in bad stories is the bad story that America is incapable of moral improvement. And that is the source of this cynical, nihilistic approach. Nah, it's never going to get any better, so it's got to be back to Hobbes before the Enlightenment. Life is an ongoing war of all against all, so let me get mine. And I understand that. That's how a damaged, wounded child feels. A kid who wasn't loved by his mother and was told by his father he could either be a killer or a loser. But that's not the predominant experience of Americans. We have been fortunate enough and blessed enough to see in our own history that there are moments of moral wrongdoing and chaos that are followed by real movements where a collective stand up together at great risk and say, this isn't, we don't consent to this any longer. We do not consent to being the objects of history. We are now the subjects of history. And as subjects, we are rising up and saying we've had enough of it. And that happened during abolition, and it happened during suffrage, and it happened during the New Deal, and it happened during the civil rights movement, and it's happened in the movement around gay rights. And it is going to continue, I hope, to happen. We're going to have to relitigate the question of voting rights, since clearly there is this concerted effort to try to suppress the vote because they know if it was a fair election, most of these atrophied, desperate, kind of clinging to power oligarchs would, their ideas, their manipulations would be voted out of public life. And so I'm honestly very hopeful that following the atrocities of this administration, if we are willing to work and stay active and stay involved and stay hopeful, that we will author a better story, not a perfect story, but that out of this mess will come a real sense of collective moral improvement. I do these workshops for democracy now. In 2016, I didn't do much. I wrote some articles. I didn't do much. In 2018, I said, you know what? I better not. I don't want history to look at me, and I don't want my kids to look at me and say, what were you doing? Because I can look at my parents, and they put their skin in the game. I can look at my grandparents who were card-carrying communists and say, they put their skin in the game. They stood up for their beliefs in the public square, and they acted out of morality in their private lives as well. And I want to feel that at this extreme time, I'm doing that. So I said in 2018, I held a bunch of these workshops for democracy where you basically ask, rather than me getting paid for students to make a donation to a candidate or cause they support, any candidate or cause they support. And this time in 2020, I said, all right, let's do it. Let's scale it up. So I did it with Grub Street and Lighthouse and a bunch of creative writing centers. And I'm seeing that a lot of people, when we all gather together and talk about who we contributed to before the writing workshop, it's a really beautiful, hopeful feeling to realize that there are so many people out there who are doing good and important work and are stepping up and trying to be citizens of good faith and recognizing that that is now their duty. It's not something discretionary. It's not another channel or another flavor at the ice cream shop. It is absolutely necessary. And I think that's basically what everybody's attitude has to be right now. There is no more room for childish things, for sort of burrowing our heads in the easy out of cynicism, or they're all corrupt, or I don't want to have to argue, or to say, well, anguish is understandable, but action is required. And so I'm actually going to put in the chat my website. There's a couple of more of these workshops for democracy. And my pal Cheryl Strayed and I are also doing a Dear Sugars reunion that I've announced online as well. I'll put my Twitter handle because I announce a lot of these things on Twitter. I feel like, look, this is our time. And I have to say, I feel a real sense, guarded, but I feel a real sense of hope that enough people have said, you know what, we tried cynicism and hatred and division, and it's not working for me on any level. It's not working for us. So I'm hopeful that we're going to see some better stories. And you guys, these questions are fantastic. Thank you so much for asking them. And thanks to the folks at the the Brattleboro Literary Festival for having this event. It's been terrific. So thanks.
Steve, thank you so much. That was fascinating and stirring. There is one question that didn't get answered that I just want to ask you really quick, because it's about the name of that Bradbury story you mentioned.
It's called "And the Rock Cried Out," and the rock cried out. But also, there's a long sort of exegesis of it in Bad Stories, if people want to find that.
So Bad Stories is available. Actually, there's going to be a splash screen right after this. So if you want, so hang on. We're going to show you how to get the book. You can order it at bookshop.org. It's also a place that you can donate to the Brattleboro Literary Festival, which we, of course, appreciate, so we can keep doing this. And once again, Steve, such an honor, such a stirring and interesting talk. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys.